Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. This week, the new right to disconnect laws have come into effect, changing the rules and expectations around after-hours contact for the workplace. The changes to the Fair Work Act give workers an enforceable workplace right to refuse to monitor, read, or respond to contact or attempted contact from their employer outside of their working hours unless such refusal is unreasonable. So, what does unreasonable mean? Who exactly does it apply to? How do companies ensure they are compliant with the new system? Amanda Lyras is a partner in the Workplace Relations, Employment and Safety team at Clayton Utz. Amanda, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
Before we jump into the details, what's the motivation behind it? What is the problem that the government is trying to fix?
So this right was introduced by the Greens Party, who were essentially concerned with the fact that we now seem to be plugged in 24/7 to our workplaces via all the tech that we use day to day. Initially, the Greens were trying to introduce a prohibition that employees couldn't be contacted at all by their employers outside business hours, but that was pulled back in terms of what was ultimately put on the table and passed recently and taking effect today.
Okay, so just how different is this law to business? Presumably these protections weren't in place already. What does a business have to start thinking about, or a manager have to start thinking about under these laws?
Well, interestingly, Sean, there is an existing right under our Fair Work Act for employers to be able to refuse to work unreasonable additional hours. That right hasn't historically been leveraged by employees in terms of claims that they have sought to bring. This right is similar, but a little bit different. It focuses less on the hours that people are working outside their usual hours and more looks at the extent to which they're being contacted or the extent to which their employer is attempting to contact them. So in terms of what businesses need to think about, the question is slightly different. It's really looking at what are the circumstances in which it's reasonable for you to be able to reach out to one of your employees after hours to contact them? And that will really depend on the nature of the employee's role, how they're remunerated, and the associated expectations in terms of what they are required to do for that remuneration. It will look at issues such as whether they're required to be on call, whether there may be emergencies that they need to attend to, or whether they work in industries where it's par for the course that people are available to respond to issues that might arise outside working hours. And so businesses essentially will need to look at their broader organisation, understand the types of work that's being performed and which cohorts of employees are reasonably required to be available after hours and which you might say are not.
I mean, look, I'm sure for years we're going to talk about what reasonable and unreasonable means, but as we stand at the moment, there's no precedent. The law has only started this week. Is it something that a business now needs to sit with different cohorts of workers and say, this is the law and this is what we expect? Or do you think it is, kind of people will just operate as they have been because that's what's been expected previously? Like, I'm just wondering if I've got 30 people in the office, 300 people in the office, how should I think about this?
In terms of doing it properly, what I'm seeing businesses do is sit down and think about who are our different cohorts of workers and what is reasonable for each of those different people. Do we have people who might be required to deal with, foreign jurisdictions outside Australia? Do we have people who are required to deal with client requests or issues after hours? So going through that process of looking at different groups individually, other businesses will probably take the view of they'll deal with issues as they arise, because in this jurisdiction, if an employee wants to raise an issue about the degree of contact after hours, they first need to raise it with their employer. So different businesses are doing different things, but it is an opportune time to think and reflect on the workforce and, when it might be reasonable or not to contact people. And the legislation does give some guidance as to what businesses should think about in terms of what's reasonable. So it talks about, what is the reason for the contact? How is the contact made? And what's the level of disruption that it might cause to the employee? The extent to which the employee is compensated to work outside of their usual hours. And that will be particularly relevant for senior and well-remunerated employees, for example. It also looks at the employee's personal circumstances, so any family or caring responsibilities they may have is also relevant.
Stay with me, Amanda. We'll be back in a minute. I'm speaking to Amanda Lyras, partner in the Workplace Relations, Employment and Safety team at Clayton Utz. Okay, now this applies to primarily larger businesses. What's the cutoff there at the moment?
So at the moment, this right applies to medium to large businesses. Small businesses have been given a bit of relief. These laws won't apply to them for a further 12 months. So 26 August 2025 is when those businesses will then need to grapple with this new right.
Okay, and what is a small business? What's the definition between a medium and a small business?
It's 15 employees or less.
Okay, so I mean, maybe it's not the actual the absolute majority in terms of number, but many businesses have 16 or more employees. So broadly, anyone employing people should start thinking about it, even if you have fewer, because in a year's time, you're going to have to think about it.
Absolutely. And I think this really ties in with workplace flexibility. They do go hand in hand. We've seen a lot of businesses introduce more flexible ways of working, and this right to disconnect will need to be considered within that broader flexibility framework.
Okay, so is there a chance this will backfire on workplace flexibility, something that we've all become very used to post-COVID, albeit there are many companies asking people to come into the office more days. But I mean, how does it sit with that workplace flexibility?
We've certainly seen some considerable debate about this in terms of the unintended consequences. Obviously, flexibility is a two-way street. So to the extent that people want to take time out of their working day to attend to personal matters, there is usually then the expectation that they will then log back on after hours to complete any work that they weren't able to do during the working day. So there will be an element of give and take. And we may well see employees who become used to the luxury of flexibility being quite open to working outside of their ordinary hours. But having said that, there will be employees that will seek to leverage this right. And we may well see employers insisting more firmly that employees are back in the office during working hours where they can be monitored.
Just on that, I mean, this is a little digression here. What are the rules around that? Can an employer insist that an employee comes in 5 days a week, generally?
So typically it will be the employer's prerogative about hybrid or flexible working practices and the extent to which people are required to be in the office or not. There is the ability for certain types of employees under the Fair Work Act to request flexible work arrangements, and there are also the potential for employees to enter into individual flexibility agreements with their employers. Those operate under a legislative regime and will sort of sit separately to this right. But putting aside those specific circumstances, employers will typically have the ability to decide where employees work and what is required during the working day in terms of location.
Okay, so based on your experience at Clayton Utz, do you think business is ready for it? Have they paid enough attention to it thus far?
Well, funny you should ask that, Sean, because we've certainly had a number of requests filtering in today from a number of our clients looking for some guidance on developing right to disconnect policies and updating contracts and thinking about how their frameworks should be moulded to deal with this new right. So I think some businesses have tried to get ahead of the curve, but for the most part, I think the majority of businesses are only really starting to grapple with what is required.
Interesting. Crystal ball gazing here, what do you expect we end up with? What do you mean? Do you think this will fundamentally change the way we work or not?
I think it will mean that employers do think more thoughtfully about how employer contact occurs through the organisation. We might see people, for example, putting delays on when emails are ultimately sent through the system, or there may be instant messaging applications that, employers elect to wait till the employees have logged on the following morning to receive that message that might have been sent the night before. So I think we will start to see, particularly through the use of technology, more thought given to how we are contacting people out of hours. I think ultimately it probably won't disrupt too much the way we are working at the moment. Probably more pressingly, this right, I think, will be most likely used by employees to leverage other types of employment-related claims. So, for example, a claim on the basis that they tried to exercise their right to disconnect and as a result they suffered some form of disciplinary action or dismissal. Those sorts of claims are probably quite likely to be used by employees who may suffer those adverse consequences and may try and point back to some exercise of this right.
So that suggests probably the next few years is going to be a lot of grey in this legislation.
Absolutely. I mean, another issue that is likely to come up is, where employers are being performance managed and to what extent they say that they were simply trying to exercise their right to disconnect and were not underperforming. So there'll be some interesting areas where this right will come to fruition and be something that employers need to grapple with and deal with.
It'll be the Prime Minister yesterday was talking about the changes improving productivity. There are business groups saying quite the opposite. The Prime Minister's view was that if you're focused on the 8 hours you work or the however many hours you work and don't have to worry about it otherwise, you'll be more productive without kind of coming down on one side or the other on that particular argument. It will certainly force some employers to change the way they operate. Won't it, Amanda?
I absolutely agree that's the case. Again, it will come down to the types of roles you have in your business, the types of demands that employers might be dealing with, because don't forget, employers have got third parties they need to respond to, particularly those who are in client-facing industries. They will be grappling with how do we, on the one hand, support our employees' right to switch off, but on the other hand, ensure that we're meeting service requirements. So there'll be lots of different pressures from different sides of the equation.
Now, not that I want to bring it up, but law firms aren't exactly known as being the easiest places to work. What are the law firms going to do, Amanda?
Well, the law firms, like all other organisations, will have to look at their operations. Law firms are a client-facing industry. There is an expectation that people are going to be available outside of the ordinary 9 to 5 working day to deal with any client issues or requests that arise. Of course, law firms are also subject to the work health and safety framework, as are all organisations, and they'll be balancing those considerations as well in terms of ensuring that they minimise employee burnout and maximise employee welfare, but at the same time imposing reasonable requirements around service delivery.
Amanda, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thanks, Sean.
That was Amanda Lyras, partner in the Workplace Relations, Employment and Safety team at Clayton Utz. This is the Fear and Greed Business Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.